Chrysler, Cadillac, all those families, all those innovators were in Detroit innovating. And he said, I want to go where all the ideas are happening. And what Ed Glazer says in his book is the decline of Detroit actually happened when Henry Ford built his 100,000 person plant. Because the skill you needed for that plant just went way down. Whereas the original gravitational pull of Detroit was idea guys colliding with other idea guys. And all of a sudden now, all you need to do is put the screw over there. And there's nothing, that's not an attack on that job. But that was what happened, that was the start of the decline, is that you didn't need idea guys anymore. And so I think what happens now is that because of the company that you built that completely disrupted the way mail is distributed, right? These old systems have to adapt. And the crappy thing is all the cities in America were built on these old industries that require you to have a factory of 500 people. And so to me, I think that what we're doing here in the future will be a model for other cities too. But I think it's an industry. I feel like I just ran a mile, but answer that question. All right, so here's my question for Pat. So, and it might sound like, but it's not. I'm always curious as an outsider, and I know that you won't hold it a bunch of things. Like, where are we doing good, and where do we just suck? Because I feel like you have such a fresh perspective, and you still travel a lot. What's the scorecard?
So in San Antonio you're talking about? And is this like startup-wise?
Both. I think quality of life. So if you have to recruit one of your investments in San Antonio, it's not easy. What are you up against?
Let me start with what's good. First of all, so I've been in San Antonio now 6 years, and I mean the city's come a long way. The Pearl was like, there was 2 buildings in the Pearl. I mean, I think Sonia was here, and I don't know. It was nothing. Downtown was worse than it is now. There were, I don't know, there's something it's hard to explain that I always think of it as like energy. There's an energy about the city now that I don't think, I mean, I certainly didn't feel 5 or 6 years ago. And I think a lot of that is because of geekdom. I think a lot of that is some of the companies that have spawned off geekdom. I think a lot of it is, there's been a whole like turnover of rackers over the last, few years that I think a lot of people have moved away, but the ones that have stayed, I think have helped create a lot of energy. And so I don't know, there's something that's happening in San Antonio that is hard to, I think, quantify, but there's definitely good stuff happening. I still think that if you're starting a startup today, it is a tough decision to stay in San Antonio. And this is not really a San Antonio thing. I think that if you're not one of the top 4 or 5, I mean, I think there's Silicon Valley, and there's a huge drop-off as to who number 2 is in terms of startup ecosystem. They're a dominant number 1, huge drop-off from there. But then there's like number 2 to 5, and I would put Austin up in that, 2 to 5 ranking.
Did you put Boulder there?
Maybe. I don't know. Maybe. Maybe 2 to 6, including Boulder. But look, I think there's New York, there's Boston. At this point, it almost becomes like, what kind of startup do you want to go build? Right. But after that, there's a huge drop-off, and I think San Antonio is in the drop-off spot. And look, I think if you're a startup today, it's hard to justify. This is where I think you and I are different too. Like, I think if you're a startup today, though I'm not starting a startup, but if you're a startup today, it's hard to justify the city building thing too. Right. Because when you're doing a startup, you've got to do whatever it takes. Right. It's like having a kid. You got to do whatever. You might have all these political beliefs about where you're going to send your kid to school and political beliefs about school systems, and then where you send your kid to school is different. And I think when you're doing a startup, it is difficult to justify doing the city building thing. I think Franklin has probably had some lessons on this one. I mean, he's building, Merge virtual reality company. Everything's happening in California. I mean, he's probably, I haven't caught up with him lately, but I bet he's on a plane a lot. I bet that's where a lot of the money that he plans on raising in the future, even though I know San Antonio's been good to him that way, but it is very difficult, I think, to prioritize this. I also think that San Antonio So at Rackspace, we always call this the 70-mile problem, which is Austin. You know, if you're in San Antonio and you've got this like great idea for a startup company that you want to do, the idea of moving to New York City can be really daunting. The idea of moving to Austin, not so much. The idea, and you know, we all rationalize our way through life, so like, you know, what a lot of people do is first they'll make the commute. They'll do it half time. You know, then they'll be there more and more and more and more. And next thing you know, not that hard to actually move to Austin. Right. So I think we have a lot of like, I don't know what to do about any of them, by the way. That's for you. But, you know, but I do think that, so anyways, I don't know. Those are my raw thoughts. Like, I don't know what that means in terms of what we're missing. You know, I think there's a lot of infrastructure coming along. Like, I think Geekdom's good. I think there's better and cooler restaurants, bars, and places for people to hang out. You know, I do think one thing that is really missing here is there is just, while there's like, you can feel sort of the energy around a startup ecosystem emerging, the reality is there's not that many well-paying jobs and there's not that many growth companies that are creating well-paying jobs in San Antonio. So like when people are cycling out of Rackspace right now, I mean, most of the ones that you know I end up talking to, they end up leaving town. Okay, we always had, you know, another problem that we always had at Rackspace, we always called it the trailing spouse issue. You know, so it was really hard to recruit somebody to San Antonio. You know, we got it done a lot of times because the spouse would always have a problem finding a job in San Antonio. So I think the more that we can fix, the more that we can get, even in some cases if we skip the startup phase. Like I know that one of the things you work on a lot is like, how can we get 2 or 3 established growth companies to relocate to San Antonio? And by the way, in the areas where we're trying to build density. I mean, I would argue that most of the companies that are creating growth jobs, Rackspace included, you know, are not doing it where there's real density, you know, which I think is another thing. And with the lack of density, you know, we're not going to get more coffee shops and more restaurants and more things like that that actually matter to people that you know want these jobs. So, anyways, the good news is I think if we can. I mean, the idea of relocating company by company. I mean, what a slog. I mean, it sounds you know really difficult. Right. But if you could actually get 4 or 5 growth companies, when I say growth company, I'm not talking about creating hundreds of jobs. I'm thinking about if we could have 5 or 6 companies that, you know, were in the beginning creating 12 jobs a year, right here, that would actually move the needle. It would actually move the needle. So
I guess my question then is, what was the reasoning behind moving FileStack? Like, I guess what were the benefits of moving FileStack to San Antonio that you found? Because obviously it was better to move it here than to keep it elsewhere.
Yes. So I would say that there was a city builder behind that move.
Okay.
And so that city builder is actively working on, you know, some of the things that I'm talking about, you know, with Lorenzo and sometimes on his own, in terms of relocating companies to San Antonio. And so I would say that in many ways that was a city building move. And now at the same time, like, you know, I see a lot of advantages to having a company, you know, in San Antonio because, so, you know, so when we built our startup many moons ago, we did it in a little town called Blacksburg, Virginia. It's not Silicon Valley. You know, we did not have access to millions of engineers and, you know, the greatest talent pool in the world, but we figured out how to be the best game in town. And that became a massive recruiting advantage for us. It still is for Rackspace today. There's 120 Rackers in Blacksburg, Virginia now, because they have access to the you know, pretty much our motto was anybody that graduates from Virginia Tech that is really good and wants to stay in Blacksburg, they should come work for us. And, you know, we're pretty good at that. And, you know, so running an emerging growth startup in San Antonio, like I don't kind of go, oh my gosh, there's, you know, no way that I can do that, because I think that if we do our job and we become successful and we start creating jobs, you know, I think we're going to be able to recruit the best people in town. There's not many other choices.
So that question, a couple questions. So when you started your first startup, as anybody who started their first business before, usually getting your first 1,000 customers, hardest thing, first 1,000 clicks, visitors, that kind of hitting that hurdle. Once you kind of hit that hurdle, that's the mythical part where you can take off and grow. So to that point, what was the main marketing strategy? I'm assuming you guys didn't have a massive budget to work with. What was the main marketing strategy you used to get kind of those first 1,000 visitors, customers? And then second, I'm assuming you didn't go to CEO school. So for those of us that are kind of just done the CEO thing for maybe a couple of years now, what was the biggest, I guess, lesson that you learned about being an effective, good CEO above all others? You could say, hey, if I had to impress this on to a new CEO, this is what you need to know.
Yeah. There's a lot of questions.
I just talked a lot.
Okay. So I'll get, okay, 2 questions. I'll get the best 2 answers I can. So, but there's a lot of answers to all this stuff. So number 1, I did not go to CEO school, that's for sure. I barely went to college, and I'm not even sure how that happened. But what I did have when we started our business was I had 2 amazing partners that were super smart. We were all in together. We all had equal equity. Even as our titles shifted and one became bigger than the other, we were all in together. And I had I think it's a big deal. So I like when I look across my portfolio of investments, one day I'm like I'll graph all this, and I totally should do it, but I can just tell you based on my gut and sort of eyeing my portfolio that the closer you are to single founder or single founder itself. And when I say closer, a lot of times single founders kind of have co-founders that are not really co-founders. They're not equal. They can't really kick each other's ass when things are not going well. So we had that. We had sort of trifecta there. And through that, I would get pushback. We would challenge each other. And we all kind of grew together. And so, today, one of those guys is the CEO of an emerging growth startup in Austin. And, so there's a billion reasons that I can tell you how I be Walt as a CEO. And by the way, I've got a ton of people together. But I think having real partners that we're in it together, we can all push each other back, we can debate endlessly without hurting each other's feelings, and truly allow the best answers to emerge. I think that was the biggest thing. I would say, to answer your other question about marketing strategy, I'm going to answer it a little differently because I can't tell you that we had the perfect marketing strategy, and I'm actually not sure that that's what startups